Good evening, Hampstead Garden Suburb Synagogue, Cockfosters and North Southgate Synagogue, and United Synagogue. This is an honor to be here at Cockfosters, hosted by my esteemed colleague, Rabbi Daniel Epstein. My name is Rabbi Daniel Friedman. I'm the Senior Rabbi at Hampstead Garden Suburb Synagogue, and we are here to continue the Rabbinic Chavrusa, the conversation in memory of Rabbi Lord Sachs. We are studying his works as a tribute to him over this year. We began this journey last month with Rabbi Shachat. This month I'm here at Cockfosters with Rabbi Epstein, and we are studying Rabbi Sachs' book, The Home We Build Together. Now, I want to thank you, Rabbi Epstein, for hosting me here this evening, and I want to say this may be one of the final opportunities to be hosted here by you. Mazel tov on your new position at Marble Arch, and look forward to many exciting activities, whether it's here or at Marble Arch over the next number of years alongside you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much indeed. It's lovely to have you here to host you. First time I think we've had an event here in the hall since March.
Wow.
So it's lovely, and I'd love to get closer, but our words will connect us, and our distance will keep us safe. We've also got our masks, so when we do get up, yours is local for Hampstead Garden Suburb, and mine is local for the top of the Premier League. So we'll make sure we keep those here just in case. But it's great to be here, and it's great to be discussing this book, and it has been an extraordinary 30 days. We are into just finished the Shloshim. It's the 32nd day actually since the Levaya of the late Rabbi Lord Sachs, and we're doing it Lilu Lishmato as well as to spend the year, and it's an amazing program you've got every month discussing each of his books, and you have more than a year's worth of material, as you know, if we do once a month, probably 2.5 years, but it's great, and this book I think is really quite special in and of itself, and I'm sure we'll get into that.
Yeah, well, let's get right into it. Rabbi Epstein, you chose to discuss this book. Tell us a little about why this particular book, your relationship with Rabbi Sachs, and what this book means to you.
Yeah, of course. It is the book I chose because it's the book of all of his books that I feel most connected to. It was a book that changed my view on British society, and at the time I wasn't living in England. I was living in Israel with Ilana and our children. At the time when I read the book, we'd just had our fourth child. And it was an amazing book to read because it just described a Britain that I didn't really know very well at that time. We'd made Aliyah in 1998. And the book was written in, I think it's 2006, 2007, if I'm not mistaken, something like that, 2007. And it came at a time when I was thinking about what I wanted to do with my life in general. I was doing public relations and enjoying that, but I was looking for just finding out a little more about the types of clients I wanted. I was getting into more of the non-profit side of things and projects, and I was connected back to friends of mine who were still in England and following sort of what was happening in British, well, at least Anglo Jewry or British Jewry. But reading the book, just seeing Rabbi Sachs' view of England, of the whole of the United Kingdom, what he thought society would need to look like, was really quite an amazing experience to get through. And so the whole approach that he takes in the book is very much about how to try and put a society back together that he felt was fragmenting before his eyes. And he was trying to get his hands, as it were, like a handle on how to define where society was and how to see where it needs to go, which came back to his wonderful phrase he always uses about the Jewish people. We don't see the world as it is, we see the world as it ought to be. And so this was his ought to be, one of his ought to be books. There are a number of them in that, I guess, in that mini-series. But this one really took an understanding of where British society was and where it needed to get to in order to put all the pieces, as it were, into a coherent and cohesive working whole.
And how did that impact, I mean, you were in public relations. Today you are one of Anglo Jewry's leading rabbis. Did this impact your decision and your journey?
It did actually, because a combination of this book and a meeting with Rabbi Sachs around that time, a little later, 2009, I think it was, 8, 9, got me thinking a lot more about what I wanted out of life. And the conversation with Rabbi Sachs went into the ideas of what I wanted to do. He was always interested in everybody, as I found out, and we've all found out over the last month, just how extraordinarily interested he was in everybody's pathways, what they were doing, and he was listening. Not just sort of interested to hear what you had to say, but thinking about what that would do to what he already knew either about you or about the problems that he saw and how you could fit together. He was just extraordinary at getting a sense of who might be able to do what without telling them what to do. He just sort of opened up an idea and an avenue, and then in my case, just sort of like, this vision of him walking off into the misty sunset, with his hands in his pockets, and you're left behind thinking, what just happened? And that was a real sense of what just happened. And what he said was that, I think you should think about Anglo Jewry, come back to British Jewry and do something with that. And he didn't say what, he didn't say when or how. He just said, from what you're saying and what you're talking about, and I quoted a little bit about the book from the book, and just shared my thoughts with him. He goes, well, you might be able to do something in Anglo Jewry, and that's where he left it. And then I started my own personal re-evaluation of what I wanted and what would be good possibly for our family. And when I shared it with Ilana, she came back with a phrase which I'm still trying to deliver on. I said, I'd like to be a United Synagogue rabbi, is what I said to her. And she said, darling, if you can pay the bills, you can do whatever you like. So we're still working on that. But it was very much a sense of, okay, that's what I wanted to do. And this book really gave me that sense that there is what to do to bring communities back.
Well, that's an amazing, inspiring story.
It was quite something. But the book itself, I think, has a lot to say.
So let's get right into it.
Yeah, let's do that.
Tell me, what are some of the major themes of the book? Actually, let's start with the stories that Rabbi Sachs himself frames his book and frames his argument with. He begins a story of 3 abodes. He says there were a number of tourists, wanderers, wandering through the countryside. They show up at a country estate. They knock on the door, they say, we need a place to stay. The fella who owns the country estate says, by all means, you're most welcome in my home. And they come in as the guests of this owner of the country estate, and they stay there as his guests. They stay there for an extended period of time. But of course, throughout that period, they are still his guests. And Rabbi Sachs says that is one model of society. Epstein, do you want to give us the second one?
So the second one, I think, is the
hotel.
second one is the hotel. So what happens is, again, the same idea. Let's take the same people ambling through a forest or ambling through the countryside. And they don't stumble on a single country house. They stumble on a hotel. And they go up to the owner of the hotel and they say, we need somewhere to stay. He goes, funny you should say that. Welcome to my hotel. And in the hotel, the usual rules of hotels work. So you can do whatever you like in your rooms. You go up to your individual rooms. There is somewhere you can come downstairs. There'll be lunch. There'll be meals served to you. Your sheets, all of your bedding will be taken care of. And as long as you're in your room, you can pretty much do whatever you like. And in fact, you in your room can do whatever you wish, and somebody in the next room can do whatever they wish. And as long as you're not disturbing each other too much and not causing too much of a ruckus in the corridors, then I think we'll all get along fine. And so you have this idea of society as a hotel where we're all in our own individual places, and we can pretty much do what we like. There's some common areas and some common needs, but ultimately, as long as you're not causing too much disruption to anybody else, you can do whatever you like. And that's his second parable of society as a hotel.
Right, so before we get to his third, which is really the solution, the way he views ideal society or the way British society could or should or might look. So let's just, I think you've packaged that second model very well. Let's just work it through just a little deeper. So in that first model, when we come, foreigners, to a country and view it as, well, we are the guests in the country, and one tries to fit in with the way the country owner or country estate owner would like you to be, but you always feel that you're an outsider, you're always a guest. You may feel that you are welcome, you're made to feel welcome, but you're never quite one of the locals. And that's the problem in the first model that Rabbi Sachs presents, the problem of outsiders coming in, and the only way that they might be able to become a part of the family is if they completely assimilate, acculturate themselves to become nothing like they were previously in their foreign identity. And then in the second model, we have what he calls multiculturalism, where they can still have their identities, but they're paid guests in a hotel. There's no ownership. They are doing what they need to do as paying guests. They're not disturbing anyone else, but they're just hotel paid guests. There's no real roots that are being sown, put down in this new form of existence. And this is the model of those who come, immigrate to a country like Great Britain, and never truly become British. They still maintain their former identities, and it's something that he says happened organically, and then once it had happened, it became, okay, maybe this is our policy now, and it was called multiculturalism. And Rabbi Sachs says that that didn't work either, and he says not only did the locals feel that that didn't work, he quotes a number of great scholars from ethnic backgrounds like himself who felt that it didn't work, that the segregation never led to integration. So let's move to the third model.
I think that, well, just to come back to the second a little bit, that idea of the second model was very much that there are still common parts. In other words, again, the hotel is a good example because many of us have stayed at hotels, or if we haven't recently, I mean, none of us have stayed anywhere in the last almost a year, but let's assume for argument's sake it's not quite, the last few months of 2020. You still can't turn up in the dining room of the hotel at 6 o'clock in the evening and demand breakfast. Right? It's just, you can't do that because even though there's certain rules and certain ways that protocols, certain sort of traditions, you want to call them, minhagim, that you can't do things which are out of step with the general common consensus of the way people behave. So then either you can go back and try and have breakfast in your own room, and literally you could have, try and order sort of all-day breakfast, and it would be a sort of, they're giving in to you, giving a little bit of assistance. But ultimately, breakfast is in the morning, lunch is in the middle of the day, you have to turn up at dinner at 7 o'clock, and in certain places, you even have to turn up in a tie and a suit. We just had a talk last week from Jeffrey Feld, whose family owned the Cumberland Hotel, one of the great Jewish hotels in Bournemouth, and you definitely had to be there at 7 o'clock in the evening, outside the door, or you wouldn't get dinner. So there was an understanding that that's what you had to do, and that's a nice parable and idea of, even though you can do what you like in your own room, in certain parts you do have to behave like the locals, and you have to sort of do the right thing at the right time. You can talk about, say, Remembrance Sunday in this community. You can talk about, we're coming up to Christmas and Boxing Day, and the country's going to behave in a certain way, and we're all expected to understand that. Shops aren't open, those sorts of things, and therefore we have to adapt ourselves, but ultimately we can still go back to our own places. The third model, as you said, I think, which is really interesting, is, okay, let's start from the ground up. You've turned up now at my house, and you said, we'd like to join, we'd like to be here. I said, well, you know what? My house is my house, and you have your ideas, but if this is going to work, we're going to have to start something maybe afresh, and we'll build it together. So tell me what works in your world, what you like about that. I'll tell you what's worked in mine, and let's try and figure out something which, for both of us, would be a much more comfortable place to live. So we like the idea of, let's say, not driving on Shabbat if we're Orthodox. So we'd like a day where there's no vehicles around. It's a quieter day. And people who don't have that say, you know what? It's not a religious thing for me. Maybe that's a lovely aspect of a week, a little quiet. It's been very busy. It's very technologically, overwhelming. We've got devices everywhere. Maybe if we turn them off for a day or so, that could work. And if we all did that, maybe we'd all be able to relax a bit. And therefore our idea, for example, of Shabbat might be something that translates into a wider society. We're not asking them to keep Shabbat. We're asking them to benefit from some of the things that we've seen over many, many generations have kept us, well, and kept us together. So I'll share some of my ideas from my culture with you. And if you like them, you might be able to adopt them. You may be able to tell me that, everybody has to turn up at a certain time to do some sort of remembrance, some sort of activity, cricket in the summer. We have to do something which pulls us all together. I like that. We'll do some of our sports, but we won't do them on Shabbat because that's us, but can we choose Sunday? Well, great. So slowly we start to build a society together that we all can live with. And that was the idea. Ultimately, if you could build a whole society from the ground up, you get over that segregation problem. You get into the integration problem, but at the same time, the integration solution, but there's going to be a fallout. You're going to lose some of the things that are really important to you because the compromise may be a little higher than you're willing to pay. So you then retreat back into the second model a little bit. And there's a tension, I think, between model 2, the hotel, and model 3, the home we build together. Almost like the Mishkan, the tabernacle, which is another idea of a project we build together to get over some of our challenges that we had earlier in our existence.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Rabbi Sachs talks about the contrast between the creation story at the beginning of Genesis and then the creation or the building construction story at the end of Exodus. The creation story at the beginning of Genesis, how many dozen verses at most, and then we get to the end of Exodus where we're building the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and we've got close to 5 parishes that seem to go over and over, but he says that's the key. He says it's not about what God built. God built this world, and God built this world. God then wants us to build this world and build this world together and construct this world together and see what we can come up with together. And the more we build and contribute together, the more we learn from one another, the more we grow together, the more we're able to. And obviously this is not just simple building, although he does use as an example Habitat for Humanity, where people are physically building together. Rabbinic Chavrusa back in Canada was very much involved with Habitat for Humanity and interfaith work, bringing together faith groups to build houses, which I think is very much along these lines. But it's obviously so much more than that. It's about the ideas that we build together.
Well, Rabbi Sachs used to joke that the reason why he said the creation was probably around 35 verses, just into the first chapter and a little bit of the second chapter of Genesis, and then 500 to 600 verses for the building the Mishkan, is because when God was building the world, he's doing it on his own. And when we were building something, it was a committee. And everyone knows that when you get a synagogue committee, there's paperwork and there's protocols and stuff to do, and designing by committee obviously takes time and effort. So that was his sort of homage to how to build a kehillah. It's messy, but it's a necessary messiness. So that's sort of, in a sense, that was his sort of hat tip to how long it's going to take and how difficult it's going to be. And the idea also of building a society together is that everyone wants to feel they have something to contribute. So everyone wants to see themselves in the project. And 35 verses is not going to do it. But 500 to 600, everybody has a bit. I want to bring some materials. I want to donate my embroidery. I want to donate my knowledge, my workmanship, my craftsmanship. I want to get everyone together. I want to be the person who organizes the animals for sacrifices, for example. I'm going to start growing and I'm going to start rearing herds so that there'll be things. So everybody finds their place, and that's really something wonderful if everybody buys into it. And of course, the Mishkan is an idyllic time because there doesn't seem to be any argument. There's no dissent. There's a little bit of afterwards about leadership, but that's not really the Mishkan itself. It's about Korach, for example, finding his moment to say, well, me too, in a sense, which is it's challenging. But what is really interesting about the project, I think, of the Mishkan is that it does allow people to do whatever they need within the confines of the Mishkan. And what happens is beautiful, is that God says that you have what it takes. So Rabbi Sachs, I think, said to all of us in some way, I know you've got what it takes. You have potential. Your job is to figure out what it is and how you're going to tap into it, because there's so much more you can give. And so he channels that godliness which we expect. God turns around to us and says, I've given you everything you need. And if you're having trouble or not able to figure it out, then it's a journey. Life is the journey. And so figure out what it is you can do best, and then be that person. And that comes back to the multicultural element, because in certain positive aspects, if I'm not different to you, and this is his, almost don't want to get into the dignity of difference idea, but if I retain my uniqueness, then I have something that only I can contribute to the conversation. If we're all much of a muchness, then we're going to lose those extreme bits of brilliance at the edges that each individual person can bring to that project. So in the Kamishkan of his Betzalel, who had this, he said, a sort of lev chacham, right? And this ruach elokim, he had this spirit of knowing what it was. And of course, Betzalel was 13 years old, if we do the chronology, which is the best story for a bar mitzvah boy. He was in charge of this entire project, and he was just out of primary school.
And you got 5 parshas that you could...
So much, whatever you want to get involved in it.
Well, I'm saying any time the bar mitzvah happens, any of those 5 parshas, you got good material.
Absolutely, and if you don't have any material, come back to Betzalel, and he's your guy at a bar mitzvah age, which I love. I love that idea. And it doesn't matter how much. If you have the spirit of what you're capable of, then actually you'll outshine everyone else no matter how much they're experienced. That's a really interesting idea. We should listen to sometimes the younger people. So that's his multicultural bit, which means that bring me what you do well, but have in mind that you're doing it because we're all in this together. The problem with the second model is that you're not really all in this together. You'll seek out, I think, as much of your own autonomy as you can within this system, and you'll start to push the envelope. And when those envelopes start to get pushed and the tension starts to build up between each of the elements or factions, then the problem is that you hunker down, you put the walls up, and that's it. And you retreat into what he calls the inward turn, where you just decide that you don't want to get involved in other people's projects. Scheingenig, as they say in Yiddish, I've had enough. And that was interesting in Britain, but what I'd like to know from you, really, is how did you feel seeing this type of project? Did you find that in Australia where you lived, or in Canada? I think that would be interesting, because there are other Anglo or English-speaking countries that you would think might have a similar culture. But was it similar to Britain in that way?
So just before we get there, I just had a thought as you were talking about the Mishkan. Rabbi Sachs talks about building and working together often happens well after a crisis. He talks about the post-war years and years of growth as a society here in this country in the couple of decades following World War II. And I want to say, today is the beginning of the light at the end of the tunnel. We've been through crisis mode. And we've, like you said, Rabbi Epstein, we haven't done this in months. And to be able to do this on V-Day, on the day that the vaccine has started being administered, is amazing.
VC Day, right? Vaccine and Coventry Day, is that what it was? That's where she got the vaccine, that lady first. Amazing, it is amazing.
I don't know, Captain Tom wasn't meant to be the first?
I don't know, I think he's done enough. He was still walking, they couldn't find him actually, God bless him.
So I mean, we have to seize those moments. I mean, a moment like this could just pass. Or we could say, wow, we've been through a national crisis together. Global, absolutely. But then I think the theory gets a little murky when we start moving globally.
Right.
But certainly on a national level, to be able to say, okay, now how do we gird our loins? How do we come together? How do we not just let this moment pass and go back to the same old inter-cultural, inter-ethnic issues, and be able to say, you know what, we all suffered, and we're all able to work on a building project together, building society the way Rabbi Sachs would have liked to have seen. So, let me back to your question about Australia, Canada.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting because this was David Cameron's idea of the big society, which they've had in many occasions, and I know Rabbi Sachs was very much involved as well to try and discuss with him, and also Rabbi Mervis as well, in that sense. He had this idea that if we all did something for the country, we had like a national project we could work on. And there's the NCS, there's National Civic Service. That was the idea of national service continued in this country well after the war was over. And there was a sense of if you were donating, if you were contributing, if you were giving your time as like a national guard in that sense, you'd be able to participate in society, you'd see what was needed, and you were basically on the clock of the country. They said, the hours belong to us, the nation. And as a nation, we want you to donate your hours into the rest of society and do what you can. And that idea of a big society was really exciting. And that was going to be the response to, I think, the multicultural divides and islands and silos which were starting to happen. And that was when we were talking about the idea of the death of multiculturalism. And I think the book was trying to say, you know what, if that experiment has, I wouldn't say it's failed, but it's starting to teeter and it's coming apart at the edges, then what are we going to have which is going to put us all back together? And so the Mishkan project for Britain was the big society idea, and there's still bits of it. You know, there's Blue Labour, there's Lord Glassman, who has this idea of Blue Labour, which is, again, the irony being Labour much more of the sense of the coming from the working classes, people who are working and the real nuts and bolts of the nation. And the Blue idea, the more Tory, Whig idea of more of a capitalist maybe approach, a greater sort of the Blues right-wing approach to politics and society. And what if you could slightly merge the two so you get sort of a purple in the middle? And that Blue Labour idea was also an idea to take the ideas of trying to give people welfare assistance, but at the same time allow them a chance to grow with some of the capitalist ideals. That would be something which, again, I think Rabbi Sachs moves into in other books.
Right.
This idea of, you know, altruist capitalism.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So what was it like? And as I said, it's really interesting for me, whether Britain we see, I mean, you can read the book and we'll get through it, but it's just fascinating if it would be the same in places like Canada or Australia, and you had that experience, and I did.
And so one thing that strikes me when I read Rabbi Sachs, I mean, he really lays it out in this book, but he mentions it a number of times. When he talks about multiculturalism and the issues, it almost feels like, I mean, we talk about in second Model 2, the hotel, that multiculturalism in Britain has become a dirty word. You know, growing up in Australia, working in Canada, living in Canada for a decade and a half, multiculturalism was something that was the ideal. And I want to read a paragraph from here that really struck me. Rabbi Sachs writes like this. He says, "I cherish the compliment once paid me by Clifford Longley in a preface he wrote to one of my books, that he's a next-door neighbor, a fellow Englishman, one of us," and then added, "and even when he's boring in an English sort of way." You know, this struck me after the tragic murder of George Floyd and the ensuing riots in America, issues of racism, and a lot of Americans couldn't understand, well, what do you mean? We're not racist. But there was something in America that, thank God we don't have it in this country. I mean, the differences, and Rabbi Sachs talks about that as well, the divide, the racial divide between black and white, and certainly brown is, you know, a major ethnic grouping in this country, but it's not the way it is in America, where it's so starkly different. Thank God that hasn't been the differences. We have maybe religious issue differences, but not to the extent, not the color issues the way America is divided. But what we do find is this notion of the one of us. Something that I've lived in America, I've lived in this country, and I love this country dearly. I was born in this country. This country has been incredibly kind to my family as they escaped pogroms in Russia in the 19th century. We have very strong roots. But having grown up in Australia and lived in Canada, it's almost like that third model that Rabbi Sachs pines for, an empty field to start new, was what Australia and Canada has, in that everybody seems to be, there wasn't a model, obviously this country has been here, you know, since time immemorial, obviously all countries have, and I think that's something that even in, when you talk about Australia and Canada and the way that they think of themselves as this empty blank page and everybody's come together on the blank page, and certainly in the last decade that they've recognized, no, there were other people, indigenous populations in each of those countries that suffered terribly with the arrival of white man, and that's being acknowledged now. But the notion of different peoples coming together and working together is something that's achievable. But how do you do that? When we say in Pirkei Avot, to be able to learn something on a page that's already been written on and having to scrub it out versus a blank page, it's tough. I mean, but you lived in Israel, and Israel is kind of...
We did live in Israel. We lived in Israel for 17 years, and that was a big change, because again, that is very interesting. I think that one of the differences, maybe, well, not even quite to Israel yet, but to England, I always think of, the country that hasn't been invaded for 1,000 years. So we've been doing English, or England has been doing English for a very long time, with not a lot of involvement of other people. So ultimately, yes, around the William the Conqueror, it was a big immigrant community, if you can put it that way. But then it was pretty stable for, a good few hundred years, and people came backwards and forwards, and small groups came in and out. But the mass migrations were only much, much later in history. And for the Jewish community, obviously, coming, our family also, we've just been through, my own family, through the last, the 17th, 18th, and 20th of Kislev, were the 3 yard sites of 2 grandfathers and a great-grandfather. And they really are on both sides, and they are very much people who are in this country. My great-grandfather came over, 1902 possibly, 03, escaping a Russian draft and pogroms in Kremenchuk, which was then, was Western Russia, and now obviously now it's actually Ukraine. But that gave them a real ability to be able to come in. For England to be so benevolent and to allow people into the country was extraordinary. And then it all stopped at the beginning of the First World War, and that's why so many Jews they conscripted into the British Army in the First World War, and the Jewish Chronicle led the charge, and every major community led the charge that you have to show this country your gratitude for allowing you in. In other words, become completely British by joining the British Army to defend this land against all of the other people who wish to invade it or do us harm. And that was a huge leveler, a huge element. And then there was no more immigration again until 1956, the Windrush generation. And look what's happening now. We're still dealing with the fallout from that. Britain hadn't quite got its head around a whole new group of people, because it had a huge block where there weren't people coming in, which incidentally is one of the reasons which is known that why the Jewish community did well. Because as you know, with an immigrant community, as people come in, they come in with more to lose, and or less to lose in a sense, and they'll do anything they can to make ends meet, and they'll do it cheaper and longer and work harder. And this is the whole work ethic, that we will just do whatever it takes. And we had uninterrupted ability to do that for a good 40 years, between 1914 and the late 1950s, early 60s. And so that was an amazing making of the Anglo-Jewish, or the British Jewish community, which is almost quite unique in history, which is why we managed to establish ourselves well and managed to become, in many places, successful, and use that success to build our community and then continue to contribute to the wider society. So we did a tremendous job, but I think had there been multiple waves of immigration from 1914 onwards, I don't know whether we would have been as successful, which is a really interesting observation. We can see that mostly in the schmutter business, with fabrics, which is really interesting. But other than that, we haven't had a lot of immigration. So when you came in, you had a lot of Britishism to get into. Whereas, as you said, Australia and Canada, I don't know much about in that sense, to a less extent, but definitely Australia. My grandfather was sent to Australia on the Dinera. So it was an amazing story of how he got there and then came back to the UK. So that whole piece was incredible. But yes, a country that had very few people in it up to about 200 years ago. So it really is a blank canvas. So that, in a sense, everybody's coming in. There's an understanding that modern society, from around the Enlightenment, interestingly, is built on the ideas of the Enlightenment, coupled with brand new communities coming in. Of course it's a blank canvas. Of course they'll do it. But then they have to deal with their not being kind to the Aboriginal and local native Indians and the native peoples. So that I think is interesting for Australia. Israel, on the other hand, is well, I think the word you can use is just crazy. Right? I mean, it's crazy because you've got a whole bunch of Jews trying to figure it out. And if you think it's bad enough with large amounts, imagine what it's like within the Jewish community. We know what it's like. Ashkenazim and Sephardim. And if you have Ashkenazim, it's not just Ashkenazim. It's Ashkenazim who are Hasidic and Ashkenazim who are Litvish, from Lithuania. And they're into the high-brow study and high-ground knowledge and capability, and the worlds of Volozhin and the yeshivas of Ponevezh and Mir. These are real, elites of scholarly capability. And if you're not a genius, how are you going to function? So the Hasidic movement starts up for people who don't need to be a genius, just come with the love that you have. So even within Western European Judaism, you have these two hugely different schools. And then if we get into the Mizrahi, the whole idea of the Sephardic Jews, whether they're the Spanish and Portuguese, or they're the Eastern communities, and you have not just every Eastern community, you have Indian Jews, and you have Bukharan and Iraqi, and Jews from Iran, and Jews from Egypt. In 1956 also, they are displaced and sent into Israel. And Jews from Tunisia, and Jews from Algeria, and Jews from Morocco, and they still retain these tremendous bonds, but they're breaking down slowly. And they're, on the one hand, losing traditions. On the other hand, they're managing to amalgamate. And you have lots of what they call mixed marriages. An Ashkenazi boy meets a Moroccan girl, and they get married, and they have, their kids, even within the Jewish community, which I think is fascinating. So Israel has become that multicultural melting pot in some ways, but you do have to lose something. In other words, you do have to compromise or dilute down some of your traditions. And for the elders of those communities, those are really sad. They're losing their traditions. There's now a resurgence. So here in the UK, for example, Rabbi Joseph Dweck is leading this resurgence, and Rabbi Levy before him, of a real pride again in a Sephardic experience in what has been broadly a public Ashkenazi community, which is again fascinating, because ultimately it was the Sephardic Jews who came over and helped to build the element of the modern part of the country, 1656 with Cromwell. But again, I think that's fascinating. But Israel, I feel, was very much, they had no choice. But at the same time, it wasn't the choice where you could be in Israel or anywhere else. You had even more limited choices. And when your choices are taken away and your boundaries are restricted, you have two choices. Either you're in and you figure it out, or you're out. And you check out of the society, you check out of the country, and you check out of the ideologies as well of Zionism, of a sense of that, and it's very difficult. So Israel has gone through hundreds of years of evolution, concatenated into this mad 70-year craziness, and they're still in the middle of it. But as an English Jew, I think, living in Israel, I picked up the language, picked up the culture, loved reading the newspapers, watching lectures, watching the news, getting involved in lectures. But interestingly, didn't quite speak to me. So all of my B'nai Akiva told me, have to be there. And all of my Britishism felt that they do community differently. And I miss that British community sense. And so when that idea, Rabbi Sachs, that conversation came back to me, it almost felt naturally appealing. Yes, I can have all the things I've picked up here. So I bring some of that culture back with me. So I think there's a tremendous amount that I can talk about by bringing them together. But again, I think the experiment is personal. I've got my experiences of Israel I bring to England. I've got my British experiences, which helps me talk to an Israeli audience. And I can imagine in your community, you bring what you've learned in Australia and what you picked up in Canada, and you can blend that into what you do in England, and you can find the best of everything, and you get a really nice uniqueness, which again, beautifully like this, only you can bring to the conversation. And you've done that in Hampstead Garden Suburb, and you've done that here as well, and you did it in Edmonton, so it's really interesting to see that. But that's the bit where
I think the more you talk about Israel here, I wonder whether Israel, I mean, we hear so many bad news stories because that's what the media thrives on, and conflict and issues between the various subcultures that you've been referring to in Israel. But I think on the whole, Israel has done a pretty good job.
Oh, it's phenomenal.
And yeah, there's that tension there, like you mentioned, that tension that you felt. But Israel is a model society, I think, really, to quote Prince Charles at the Shloshim, and Or Lagoyim, and apparently that is no longer a derogatory term.
So it's part of the English vernacular.
That's right. Although I think he might have used it as well back in January at Yad Vashem. So it's daily parlance for
But music is a great leveler. So you can look at the music which happens right now, the types of artists that are really coming through. I mean, one of Rabbi Sachs's favorite artists of late was Yishai Ribo, right? Who is singing from a very Mizrahi approach, but his music brings so much warmth and depth, and we're willing to do that. So we've been through two of these events. We've had people coming in to the country, as it were, into Israel in the 1950s and 1960s, and they bring with them a very, very rich, deep, thousands of years worth of culture from where they came from. Right? There are Jews who were in Iran for 2,400 years, in Aden for 2,600 years. These are huge cultures, and they bring them back, and then they have to change so quickly. And it's been very difficult. So the first generation, 2 generations, was holding on for dear life to these traditions they thought they would lose. And now what's happening is that some of the community, or some of the third generation, was saying, you know what, I've had enough of this. Nimas, it's too much. I don't want all this stuff. I don't need to do 400 Zmirot every Shabbat lunch, right? I don't need to do all that Zmirot for the Hakafot and to go through books this thick to get through. And there's 3 guys at the front who insist we have to sing every song. And they just were out. But now there's starting to be a new appreciation of this, that it's actually contributing something to me and it's not threatening anymore. So we're into that 4th generation of being willing to have a comfort of where we are and to take in some influences from other cultures which add to our appreciation and don't detract from who we are. And that 4th, the 3rd verse that puts to bed the dichotomy between the first 2, that's really lovely. And we're watching that now in Israel a little bit. And we're watching it here as well, that we're coming to a point where it comes back to if you're comfortable with who you are, and then you can go out and talk to the world about it. And that was Rabbi Sachs, I think, if we had to summarize in a sense, I think, what he was. He was so comfortable with who he was able to share that, and he wouldn't feel like he'd been diminished.
So I think there's an important concept that is really Rabbi Sachs's punchline in the book, which is the notion of covenant. That we would be remiss if we didn't spend some time on it.
The social contract and the social covenant, what he talks about, absolutely.
Right. So, I mean, we're used to, when you talk about the social contract, or the hotel model, or whether it's the first model, the country house, where we think, we come in, we pay our dues, and we can do what we like. But he says, no, covenant means we're responsible for one another. And we're contributing to one another because we want something for the common good, for the greater good. We want to build this together. And there's something that goes beyond just paying the bills or paying our taxes and expecting the state to take care of things, or expecting that individuals can do whatever one wills. No, covenant says that we need to be tolerant of one another and be able to boost one another, and together we can make society so much greater. One of the things that strikes me in Rabbi Sachs's summation of the difference between covenant in America versus England, he says America has a story, and you listen to the way presidents give their inaugural addresses.
Oh, he's so fond of those inaugurals. He really is, and they're beautiful.
And they tell stories, and they're often religious stories. He says, here in Britain we don't have a story. So I'm going to challenge that. I think we do have a story. I think that, especially over the last year, but really, this story's been brewing for decades, we have a story. Sometimes the story's not so comfortable, but we have a story. And that story has brought us to where we are today. That story is a story of imperialism, colonialism, being number one in the world, and unfortunately we're at a point now where we're perhaps throwing the baby out with the bathwater, where we say to ourselves, we're so embarrassed of what we might have done in the past that, okay, so what might our story be now? We're embarrassed as English people, the foreigners, you tell us what to do. We come from nowhere. He talks about the student who says, I don't come from anywhere. Yes, you do. Yes, you do. We have a proud tradition, a proud history as Brits, as Britain, of making this world, this globe, an amazing place to live. Were there mistakes along the way? Yeah, we're human. To err is human. We've made mistakes, and we've grown from those mistakes. But we shouldn't think that we don't have a story. We have an amazing story.
It's tough. It's tough to grapple with. Again, if you're not comfortable with where you are, then you can't actually go out and explore the uncharted territory or the unexplored wilderness, as Jordan Peterson might talk about, right? The idea of outside of the realm you know is the realm you don't know. And then there's the realm you don't even know that you don't know, which is, as you further out you move, the more you find out you don't know, which is lovely. But then you have to be careful that you only work within the confines of what you understand, and from that point, look and peer into the unknown, build yourself a bridge, and then walk across it. You can imagine you're trying to get across a river, and you sort of put the blocks in front of you. And I have always this vision of Magneto in the Marvel movies as he's walking up front, and he is able to bring, because he controls magnetism, he controls magnetic fields, so he can build bridges piece by piece as he's walking. And I have this vision of him. He puts the pieces in front of him just before he puts his foot down on them. So he's building himself a world where 2 steps forward he'd fall into the abyss. But he's put just enough pieces in front of him, even if he has nefarious tendencies. But he's building what he needs as he's doing it. And I think that's interesting. You talked about the contract versus the covenant. And I think that's really interesting. And it's the idea of the contract comes with rights, and the covenant comes with responsibilities. And that's the difference. And when you have a contract, you'll start waving it at people, but I'm entitled to, a quiet room. I'm entitled to a sea view, right, from my cruise. I paid for it, it's on the paper, I'm entitled to it, and you'll stand and insist on your rights to the detriment of everyone else. Because it's you and the contract and the person who you signed the contract with, and nothing else matters. And you can get very, very difficult, you can get violent, emotionally, verbally, physically, because you believe that what you're holding entitles you to the rights that are printed on this document. That's not a way to build anything. You get a very, very difficult environment with that if you build everything on contract. If you have a covenant, the idea is, and as you said, the founding fathers, you always want to hear the words that they quote the Bible, they quote the idea of having people before you, standing on the shoulders of the giants who came before us. There's a sense of a responsibility to pick up the mantle of everything that people have built, good or bad, as you said, right? And all of that history and all of that baggage and all of that challenge, and your job is to take it forward in the best way possible. And that's the covenant. And the covenant means that we're in this whether we like it or not. There's no break. So this idea, and Rabbi Sachs talks often about marriage, and we can get into all of that maybe for another conversation, but he believes that sanctity of marriage is the covenant, where, yes, it's a contract, there's a ketubah, which is a literal financial contract. If you do this, you're entitled to that, right? I'm entitled to look after my wife, right, in this instance, and she's entitled to the things that the contract says: food, shelter, warmth, and marital rights. She's entitled to conjugal rights. It's all written there, and I have to deliver on these, and failure to deliver on one of these parts could invalidate the contract, and we're off to the next part, which is the document we don't want to ever see, which is sadly the document of divorce. But the contract said something, but that's just the baseline. As it were, it's the foundation that allows you to build on top of it a covenant, where we're going to figure this out together, and we're not going anywhere. No matter how difficult it gets, we're in. We're all in. And that's the hard part. And it's the idea that God says, I'll never leave you, right? Lo azovcha, right? I'm never going to leave you. And you're never going to leave me, and we're going to wrestle with each other and grapple with each other. As we said, Rabbi Sachs, with the name Yaakov, Tzvi. Right? So Yaakov is Jacob who wrestled with the angel. And he speaks about, we wrestle with God, and God wrestles with us. This is not a pretty relationship. This is a relationship we have to roll our sleeves up and get into it. And it's going to be tough, and it's going to be difficult. There's a relationship between the Brits or British people and their history, our history. There is colonialism and there is imperialism, but these were ideas at the time which were trying to advance society. I mean, sometimes you'll say, well, it would advance my society over yours. I believe I know better than you about how to build society, so I'm going to impose my ideas on you. So then you have to deal with the consequences of that, where you've told somebody how to live. They're not going to enjoy it. If you've come to a consensus together of how society might move forward, such as the Enlightenment movement, such as John Locke, who he bases a lot of his ideas on, Locke and Montesquieu and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and he's talking about all of these ideas, and Hobbes as well, and all of these notions that give us a freedom to understand. Those are the people who help us to move forward with ideas of society. But if you impose them on others, like imposing anything, I demand that it should be like this because I know better. It's good for toddlers who don't know they shouldn't put their fingers in a socket. But if they're older, why not explain to them the idea of electricity, and they too will understand. You don't put your fingers in a socket because there are consequences. So the imperialism and the colonialism got us to where we are, some of it good, some of it bad, and the people who are feeling disenfranchised now have a new voice, and they're expressing it for the first time, and they have some genuine gripes. There are hundreds of years of slavery. The whole continent of Africa, as we learned when we went on, in fact, Rabbi Mermis's Ben Azai program, we took, myself and Ilana went to Ghana with a group of students to try and see what we were trying to understand about why Ghana, or why African society in general, hadn't advanced as far, as quickly as the rest of the world, and because their resources were being stripped out of that continent for the betterment of people who decided that they know better how to control not just resources, but in fact people were resources as well. And we are living with catastrophic fallout from that. But society all moved forward, and the globe moved forward because of that. So there is progress that has been made. There's a tremendous wrong that needs to be understood. It can't be righted. It can be understood and contextualized. And that means we need to be patient and understanding. And if people are upset, and if racism is rearing its head, and America now is getting very polarized, you can't just be non-racist. You have to be anti-racist, right? There's a whole idea. You can't adopt a non-approach. You have to be all for or all against, and you have to be violently for or violently against. And if you're a moderate, you're just not part of the conversation. The vast majority of people are moderate in the world.
And he talks about, civility as being the ultimate virtue.
Absolutely. Just be civil. But what happens is we're being pulled into a very, very scary world, which he didn't predict or didn't talk about in this book, because we hadn't really got into the real second generation of the internet, where people are expressing themselves quite vehemently with not a lot of comeback. And as a result of that, we're being taken to the very extremes, and we need people building something in the middle that's more wholesome to help people who are expressing themselves so violently to come back and say, that's not the way to have any type of conversation. He talks about toleration, I think, in chapter 17.
Yeah,
right?
and in his latest book of morality,
Right.
he does, he bemoans cancel culture, where you don't like somebody's opinion, and so they no longer exist. Because one thing that you didn't like about them, that
it's worth cancelling everything they've done because you agree with something small. It's a very myopic way of seeing the world. Yes, I disagree with some things that people have done. The best thing to do is, if you get a chance, pick up the phone, or you write a letter, or you have abilities to communicate with people and say, I need to understand more about why you did that. And people aren't able to have long-form conversations like we're having. And as a result of that, we're not going to come to an all-complete agreement in an hour. We won't come to complete agreement in a lifetime. But the joy of having a conversation we know is going to continue. I think that is what we need to teach. If that's anything, that's something we need to, I think, help people to understand. And that's a home we can build together. A home of enough patience to have a conversation, leave at the end of an hour with no greater agreement, but an appreciation for the respect of having a conversation where we may disagree completely, but I'm happy to disagree with you next time and the time after that. And over the course of time, we'll develop a great friendship, an adversarial friendship maybe, or a respectful friendship that we're going to agree to disagree because we've discussed it.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is interesting.
Well, amen to that. We've had some disturbing incidents lately in our ranks, pillars of British society, whether it's Cambridge or Eton, and hopefully we can find resolution. We can find people who are willing to sit at the table and have adult discussions, mature discussions, and say conversations are important and nobody should be cancelled or written off the story because they had a different opinion.
So that, I think, is that's the new challenge. The new challenge is there are going to be things that you disagree with, and normally it would just be, well, we'll sweep them under the carpet, or they won't have a voice anyway. So what happens is the people with the establishment on their side and with the tradition and the culture on their side could bulldoze other opinions which didn't agree with them. Now what's happening is there's a snapback. The people with the more, I guess, the more radical or the less mainstream opinions are being equally forceful at their point, and they're not willing to give in to others who said, well, this has been running this way for such a long time, it's not fair, we've always been suppressed. Trump is a classic example of this. He gave a voice, or so we believed, to the people who felt they were never being listened to, because he said, I'll be the voice of the little guy who never got listened to. Obama said the same thing, I'll be the voice of the little guy who never got listened to. But the Trump little guy was angry, and so came out, and his anger was given validation, which is a difficult place to be. In Obama, I think it was that the little guy wasn't listened to, but he had something he wanted to share, and he was given time. So his little voice was more of a voice that would contribute to a larger ongoing conversation. So again, it's not that I come out one side or the other. I wouldn't come out in that conversation as partisan, but there are different approaches to allow the unspoken to speak. The question is, what do you do with your newfound voice? And I think that was anti-Semitism as well.
Yes.
The fact is that now we're on the front pages of the newspapers all the time with Corbyn, with a lot of things that are happening. And the question is, this is what happens. Now you're on the front page of the national newspapers on an almost daily basis. What are you going to do with your newfound visibility? Most people would prefer to keep it quiet. But other people said, okay, now that I'm so visible, what will I do with this responsibility that I have of having the chance to make a statement to society constantly? And we saw what happened. In the last election, we had some very unusual statements which weren't the way that things normally do. Faith leaders don't normally get involved at the national level in the political discussion, but they did.
Yes.
They felt they had it, and Rabbi Sachs was one of them who came out vehemently saying, this is wrong.
And we have so much to be grateful to faith leaders that weighed in, like the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Yeah.
Well,
Because these felt they were pushing what they felt was so come back to the British story.
and of course,
away
our
from
chief
where it
Rabbi
was-
Mervis, may he live and be healthy.
Absolutely. As well came out beautifully, came out. He had something to say. Whether you agreed or disagreed with him, there were some huge eruptions whether he should, he shouldn't have. But that's a debate we're willing to have, right? Let's have a debate after somebody's taken a stand, principled on the way that they felt was the best they could muster with all of the knowledge and capability and responsibility that they had to make a statement. And I think that was important. So yes, you may disagree with what they said, you may disagree with what Rabbi Mervis had said, or Rabbi Sachs had said even. You shouldn't weigh in on these political discussions, this is not the way we do things, but there was something that needed to be said. And now it's been said, let's discuss it. And that, I think, is the healthy part of the conversation. Some difficult things need to be said, but in a way that fosters continuing agreement and continuing disagreement in a dialogue rather than a comment that shuts everyone else down. That's not a game you want to play.
I mean, I think that, I know the hour is late, so I do want to thank you, Rabbi Epstein, for this such an intriguing and amazing conversation this evening. The home we build together, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, I don't know if, certainly Anglo-Jewry hasn't seen, but throughout our Jewish history, it's been a rare individual that we have seen, like Rabbi Sachs, who has so built the local society. To be a confidant of Prince Charles, confidant of prime ministers, to be able to hear from former Prime Minister Tony Blair at the Shloshim. Our grandparents could only have dreamt of a prime minister or a prince knowing what a Shloshim was. But that's on account of...
And on both sides of the political divide. So as trusted to a Labour leader as you would be to a Conservative leader, because beyond it, there are messages, and as you said, there is a story, a British story that's higher and that's more illustrious than the partisan politics that sometimes comes out of these, and what Rabbi Sachs was talking about, I think, was ultimately that if you look at the real values, the ones that drive communities, that drive society, then regardless of your political view, which ultimately is your best effort at coming to what you want for the country in the best possible way, you take a conservative view, you take a more labour, you take a more a welfare system type view, then you're just trying to do the same thing, which is to look after the maximum number of people in the best way you can manage. And that is the way that Rabbi Sachs approached everything. I want to take my knowledge and my experience and share with you as much as I can to help you move forward in the best way possible. And I'll tell you what I know, and I'll share with you what I think, but I won't tell you what to do.
But he did that. I think he really changed the course, because politicians listened to him, and he's changed the course of British history. And so it's not just the Jewish community that owes Rabbi Lord Sachs Zatzal a great debt, but it's all of us, this entire country, and may we continue to build on his teachings for generations to come. Thank you so much.
Thank you for being here, and it's lovely to be here in our hall again, and please God, as we said, Ken Yubu, we should be able to do this many times again for many people, and to have a chance to be together and have wonderful conversations. So thank you very much, Rabbi Friedman.
Thank you, and thank you to all our viewers this evening. We hope that you have enjoyed the conversation, and we encourage you, please join other conversations. Please do read the book yourself, and if you have any questions, feel free to email either of us. We would love to continue the conversation with you.
With pleasure.
Have a good night, everybody.
Good night.